Most men lead lives of quiet desperation. Henry David Thoreau wrote those words in 1846 when he lived in isolation on the shores of Walden Pond. Now, I don't know where Thoreau collected his data, but I do know that his words are true today. As many of you know, there is a disengagement crisis inside organizations. Just a few months ago, Gallup published a survey showing that only 30% of Americans say that they are really engaged in their work. 20% absolutely hate their jobs, and the other 50% are pretty indifferent. These results echo APA's own research. Gallup has estimated that the cost of this disengagement is a staggering $500 billion a year in lost productivity. If you look deeply inside the everyday lives of people at work, as I did in my research, you'll find that far too many of them are quietly disengaged from what they do. But there are many bright spots in this desolate landscape, and those spots are the companies that we honor here today. As an APA member for many, many years, I'm really proud and I'm delighted to be here to celebrate the 2014 winners of the Psychologically Healthy Workplace Awards. These companies somehow have managed to get it right. My research shows that there are specific things that managers can do every day, no matter what their level inside an organization, that can make a true difference for every person who works inside that organization. Our research question is a pretty simple one. What makes people happy, motivated, productive, and creative at work? Now, this is an important question because although the award-winning companies obviously did this right, it's not completely obvious, maybe even to them, exactly how they did it. Our research shows that there's way more to a psychologically healthy workplace than simply having employees who are engaged. Those companies manage to create a dynamic that many managers, even some of the best managers, are completely unaware of. So let me illustrate the power of inner work life by telling you the tales of two companies from our research. I use that phrase from Dickens to describe inner work life. Let me define this for you. Inner work life is the combination of perceptions, emotions, and motivations that people experience every day as they react to and try to make sense out of the events at work. Your perceptions are just your judgments, your thoughts, your impressions of what's happening and what it means. It's your perceptions of your organization, your boss, maybe your colleagues, your subordinates, maybe even yourself. Your emotions are simply your affective reactions to what's happening. Could be intense or mild, could be positive or negative. And your motivation is your drive to do what you're doing. And we focus in our research in particular on intrinsic motivation. And that's the motivation to do something because it's interesting, enjoyable, satisfying, personally challenging. I want you to think about your own inner work lives for a moment. Especially think back to your first 5 years in your career. I'm going to ask you a specific question. During those first 5 years, were you ever in a meeting with higher status people when one of those higher status people said something that you considered so outrageous that you were momentarily stunned? Raise your hand if that happened to you. Okay. Now, maybe a lot of hands up, Now, raise your hand if you immediately said what you were thinking in reaction to that. Many fewer hands. I see 2, 3. Okay. Many fewer hands. And it's like me. Like most people, We don't show what we're thinking and really feeling at work, especially to our bosses, and it's especially if it's negative. That's why we call it inner work life. It's mostly hidden. It's mostly unobservable. And the question is, does it matter? Does it matter for performance, what people are thinking, what they're feeling at work? You know the answer. Yes, it absolutely matters. It matters a lot. So now, let me get to those tales of two companies that I promised to tell you about. It really was the best of times and the worst of times, because one of these companies was the very best of all the companies that we studied, and the other was the absolute worst. But you know, the worst company was kind of like the evil twin of the best company. These companies were remarkably similar before we started our research. In fact, we only studied companies that looked quite successful. Both of these companies were profitable. They were known as the innovative leaders in their industries, and they were both known as great places to work. But within a few years of us finishing our research, the paths of these two companies had begun to diverge wildly. I'm going to start with the worst company in the research. It's a company we call Carpenter Corporation. I can't tell you the real names of these companies because we have a lot of confidential information on them. But I can tell you, if you knew the names of these companies, you would absolutely all recognize them. Carpenter is one of the best-known consumer products brands in the world. I want you to imagine that you're standing in the parking lot of the building where you work with your colleagues, watching silently as the contents of that building are being auctioned off. Your computers, workstations, your desks, your chairs, your telephones. You used to be proud to work for this company because it was known for its cool, innovative products and its great work environment. But a few years ago, innovation began to fizzle. Profitability tanked. The company was acquired by a smaller rival, and now it's being completely sold off. And it's breaking your heart. That's the story of Carpenter Corporation. It's the demise of one of the great consumer products companies of the 20th century. The best company in our research is one that we call O'Reilly Coated Materials. They make coated fabrics for weatherproof clothing and a wide variety of other applications, known for quality and innovation around the world. So we studied O'Reilly and Carpenter in the same time frame, and they actually used some of the same raw materials, so their economic conditions were roughly similar. And yet Carpenter lies dead, but O'Reilly is still thriving at the top of its industry. And the question is why? What made the difference? We had a lot of data on both of these companies, and I can tell you what it was not due to. It wasn't due to any of these things. These are both public companies. They had very similar reward systems. They were able to hire at the top of the skill levels in their disciplines because everybody wanted to work for these companies. They were known as great places to be. And it's not the personalities, because we have personality data on all of the people who participated in our research, and the personality profiles in these two companies were quite similar. When we delved into all the data that we had, we discovered that what really made the difference between these two companies was inner work life, the inner work lives of the people who are in the trenches doing the work of these organizations every day. It turns out that a new top management team had been hired at Carpenter not long before we started our research. And by what they said and did every day, they slowly poisoned the work environment and soured inner work life. So I said a few minutes ago that inner work life is hidden. It's mostly unobservable, so you might wonder how we observed it. We decided that the best way to do that would be to ask people who are participating in the research to send us a daily, confidential electronic diary about their workday. Over many days, many weeks in fact, during the entire course of a project that they were working on that was important, that required creativity. So here's the data that we collected. We studied 3 industries, 7 companies within those industries, 26 teams that were charged with doing the most important creative, innovative work of those companies. For example, developing new products or solving the most complex client problems. Those teams had a total of 238 professionals who individually participated in this research, sending us their private diary entry every day, on average for almost 5 months, Monday through Friday, which ended up giving us nearly 12,000 individual diary entries in our database. This is, of course, an absolute treasure trove of data. We have numerical data because the daily diary form had scale ratings asking people to rate essentially their inner work life for the day, their emotions that they were experiencing during the workday, their perceptions, and their motivations. We also had numerical data on each person's performance. Now, this didn't come from the diaries. We have separate numerical data on performance from multiple ratings over time from the coworkers and the supervisors of every person who participated in the research. To me, the best part of our database are the stories that people told in their diaries. We asked them, briefly describe one event that occurred today that stands out in your mind. It can be anything at all, as long as it's relevant to the work or the project. Let me give you a couple of examples of the diary entries that people wrote. This first one is from Carpenter Corporation. That's the worst company in our study. It's from a product manager that we call Sophie. Sophie said, "I don't understand why R&D kills so many of my projects, yet I'm supposedly measured on new product development. The VP of R&D killed my new handheld mixer 3 times before it was approved a couple weeks ago. Very conflicting goals, causing us to start, stop, restart, etc." Now, this was one of Sophie's very worst inner work-life days. This day, her intrinsic motivation was 2.5 standard deviations below her own baseline, and her affect, her emotions, 1.5 standard deviations below her baseline. Contrast that with this diary entry from O'Reilly, the best company in our study. This is a team leader that we call Dave. Dave said, "Presented 1.5 hours worth of technical data, market information, process capability, and cost information in the project review. The review was very well received. Much assistance was given, and we passed. We were allowed to go on to the next stage." 2 exclamation points. By the way, Sophie had exclamation points in her diary entry too, but I think they meant something different. So, when we put together the inner work-life data with the performance data, we made our first big discovery, and it's what we call the inner work-life effect. We found that all 3 aspects of inner work-life drive 4 aspects of performance. On those days and those weeks and those months when people are having their most positive perceptions of the organization and their colleagues and their bosses, themselves, on the days when they're feeling the most pleasant emotions, and when they're having the strongest intrinsic motivation for their work, that is when they're most likely to be creative in their work and productive as well. They're also more likely to demonstrate commitment to their work and to be better colleagues to each other, which of course raises everyone's performance level in the organization. We even found in one of our analyses that if people are in a better inner work-life state on one day, not only are they more creative, more likely to come up with a creative idea that day, they're even more likely to come up with a creative idea the next day, regardless of the next day's mood. An incubation effect gets set up if people are in a positive inner work-life state. So if inner work-life is so important for performance, and it is, the next question is, what drives inner work-life? To get at this, we went into those diaries, we analyzed every single one of the 65,000 discrete events that were reported in those diaries, categorized them to see if we could find patterns. What kinds of events were happening most prominently on people's very best inner work life days. And we found one thing that stands out above everything else, one kind of event that swamped everything else, and that's simply making progress in meaningful work. That's what we call the progress principle. The number one driver of inner work life is progress in meaningful work. Now, I want to say a few words about those last two words, meaningful work. Because, you know, if people were doing work, getting a lot done on something that they considered meaningless, it didn't necessarily enhance their inner work life. People have to feel that they're making a contribution to something that they value. Let me give you a couple of examples of that from companies that I've worked with a little bit. Do you know the mission of Google? It's to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Many engineers at Google are really turned on by that mission. Imagine that, organizing all of the world's information. And what they're doing is making it accessible and useful to us. At Genentech, the biotech firm, the mission is to create, develop, and market innovative, high-quality new medicines to meet unmet medical needs. And the American Psychological Association. I don't know how many of you know the mission of the APA, but it is to advance the creation, communication, and application of psychological knowledge to benefit society and improve people's lives. I find that mission incredibly meaningful. Think about the mission of your own organization. Is it something that you and your colleagues know? Do you value it? Can you see the connection between what you do individually every day and the ultimate achievement of that mission? If the answer is yes, then making progress in your work should and will enhance your inner work life. Let me show you how prominent progress is on the very best inner work life days. Fully 76% of people's best days included at least one progress event. Setbacks are the opposite of progress. They're feeling stalled or blocked in the work, or even feeling like you're moving backwards in what you're doing. Setbacks were much less prominent on the best days at work. But there's a dark side to the progress principle, and that's what happens on the worst days, the worst inner work life days. We found the mirror image on those days. The single most prominent event by far is setbacks in the work. And progress is much less prominent on those worst days. But you know, it's not only about huge breakthroughs or spectacular failures. The progress principle is also about small incremental steps forward, what we call the power of small wins. I have a great example of this from a different company. This is a high-tech firm, and this quote is from a programmer that we call Tom. Tom had been working for a few days on a very complicated program for an important client, and there was a bug in the program that he was having trouble figuring out. And the day he managed to fix the bug, this is what he said in his diary. I smashed that software bug that's been frustrating me for almost a calendar week. That may not be an event to you, but I live a very drab life, so I'm all hyped. No one really knows about it. 3 of the team members who would be involved are out today. So I have to sit here rejoicing in my solitary smugness. I love how happy Tom feels there. So there are a few important things in that diary entry that I wanted to point out. First of all, Tom tells us about the causality. He doesn't just say, I felt good today and I solved a problem today. He says, I felt good because I solved a problem. And we found this in many diary entries where people reported progress. We didn't tell them, let us know how the event made you feel. We just said, report the event. But it was as if the bulletin was incomplete if they didn't tell us how elated they felt. We saw the opposite with setback events. Another thing to notice is that this was just a bug. In the grand scheme of Tom's career, even in the grand scheme of this project, it was no big deal. But the thing is, it was a big deal. It was a big deal to him on the day that it happened. In fact, we discovered that fully 28% of seemingly trivial events had a major impact on inner work life on the day that they happened. Unfortunately, it works in the negative direction too. And we found in our research, as many other psychologists have found, that negative events have a stronger impact on inner work life than positive events do. So, a couple of implications here for managers. First of all, you really do have to sweat the small stuff. It's especially important to try to remove those everyday hassles that can get in the way of making consistent progress in the work. Another implication is that, it's great to have what Jim Collins calls big, hairy, audacious goals. They are very motivational, but what you need to do is set up interim goals to get there so that people can have more opportunity to experience those small wins. So, if making progress is so important for inner work life, and inner work life is so important for making progress, what is it that actually supports progress in the work? And what is it that supports inner work life? When we delved back into the diaries, we found two classes of events that were extremely important. The first we call catalysts. These are events that directly support progress in the work. The events that we call nourishers nourish the human spirit. They directly support positive inner work life. Let me go through the catalysts first. The first one is clear, meaningful goals in the work. People have to know what they're doing, what they're supposed to be doing, and why it matters. But that has to be coupled with autonomy in how to achieve those goals. Think back to those diary entries I read from Sophie and Dave. Sophie and her team had no clear goals. They never knew when they walked in the morning what they were going to be doing because they were constantly being told to start one thing, then stop it, then start it up again, with no explanation, no consultation. And they felt that they had no autonomy. They felt like puppets being pulled around in one direction or the other. Dave and his team felt that their top leaders were collaboratively setting goals with them and giving them autonomy in how to achieve those goals. Sufficient resources in the work. Not lavish, but sufficient to get the work done. Help when the work is difficult. And that can mean access to expertise in the organization or even outside the organization. It can mean access to important information. It could mean a manager sitting down next to someone and helping them to work through a particularly difficult bit in the work. Learning from problems and successes is one of the most important, yet one of the most difficult catalysts for managers to implement, especially the part about learning from problems. The immediate impulse, in many cases, when something is tried and it fails, or there's a mistake, is to just kind of sweep it under the rug, or, alternatively, to harshly criticize whoever was responsible for it. But in the best teams and the best companies that we studied, what happens when a failure occurs is that people focus on the work. They say, what happened here? What did we do? Let's figure out what we can learn from it. How can we extract failure value from what just happened? They actually talk about mistakes and failures more in these organizations, not less. And people don't mind. People are very open about it. And that brings me to open idea flow within the group, between groups in the organization, and even with groups outside the organization. A constant flow of new ideas and openness. Not that all ideas will be accepted, but that all ideas will be respected and given a fair hearing. And finally, sufficient time in the work, but not too much time. Time pressure is one of the most interesting factors we studied. We discovered that the optimal level of time pressure for creative productivity is something like a low to moderate level of time pressure. Enough so that people know there is an urgency, there's a real need for this work that you're doing, but not so much time pressure that people literally have no time to think, no time to explore for a more creative solution. These factors, these kinds of catalysts, were not particularly highlighted in the profiles of the award winners today. But my guess is that these catalysts are being implemented by managers within these companies, because you would not have such satisfied employees who are so enthusiastic about their organizations if they didn't have these catalysts helping them to make progress in meaningful work every day. Now, the nourishers are things that are very obvious in our award winners today. These are things that we are celebrating. These are the things that we are talking about. And I think these are things that you're all very aware of. The first is respect and recognition for individuals at work. Showing respect for people as human beings by doing things like having work-life balance programs. Showing respect for them as human beings by offering them programs to improve their physical health. Offering recognition not only at the company level, but offering programs where peers can recognize each other, show that they appreciate each other. Encouragement when the work gets difficult, a sense of confidence. We know you can do it if you persevere. Emotional support when people are having difficulties in their personal or their professional lives. Many of our best companies do that by offering on-site psychological counseling, for example. And finally, affiliation and camaraderie, giving people the opportunity to get to know, trust, enjoy each other as people. Things like group activities around wellness. Things like sharing their own personal values in This I Believe essays. These are the things that you're doing so beautifully and so well as the catalysts. None of these things are exotic. None of them should be that difficult. The progress principle seems kind of obvious too, doesn't it? We wondered if it really was obvious to managers. So after we discovered it, we sent a survey to almost 700 managers from companies around the world. And we asked them to do a very simple thing. We listed 5 employee motivators, and we asked them to rank them in terms of how important they thought they were. And here are the 5 factors: recognition, incentives, clear goals, progress in the work, and interpersonal support. Of course, these are all motivators, but we wanted to see, would these managers rank progress as number 1? Because we know from our research, not only is it number 1, it's number 1 by a lot in terms of keeping people motivated in their work every day. So, did they rank progress number 1? Not so much. Number 1 was recognition. So, to be fair, if I had done this before I carried out the research, I would have picked recognition as number 1. What they picked as number 2 was clear goals. And they didn't pick progress as number 3 either. That was incentives. And number 4 was interpersonal support. Yes, you guessed it. Progress came in dead last. In fact, only 5% of these managers ranked progress number 1. Think about it, if they had been doing this randomly, 20% should have picked it as number 1. So it's as if they were actively saying they didn't think progress was that important. Why? I think it's because they don't understand what a difference it can make for people to make even small wins in their work. That's what makes these award winners today, these award-winning companies, so extraordinary. You get it. You put into practice the belief that people perform better when they have great inner work life. And that inner work life is enhanced when people are able to get somewhere on work they care about. So what's the takeaway from all of this? How can you actually implement the progress principle? In organizations, everyone has a role to play. No matter whether you're the CEO of the organization, the leader of a department, or the leader of a small team, or even an individual contributor. You can make an extraordinary difference by trying to create a climate of attention to progress, where everyone is looking for ways to help each other make progress every day. If you do that, if you show respect to the people who work with you and for you directly, if you find ways to catalyze their progress every day, that will enhance their inner work lives. And they will behave that way toward other people in the organization, which will create a kind of positive contagion effect, which will affect you positively as well. And the organization will reap the benefits of having more committed and collegial employees who are creative and productive to boot, supporting positive long-term success of the organization. So I want to end with a little story from an information management team in one of the high-tech companies that we studied. This team had barely 8 days to solve a complicated problem for a client, an important client, with $145 million at stake for the company. We saw more examples of the progress principle, more catalysts and nourishers in those 8 days than we saw in some other companies the entire time that we studied them. The top leaders of that company went in and showed the team how important their work was, encouraged them in what they were doing, even though it was very complex and very difficult, and did things like stopping by in the evening with hot pizza and cold bottled water. Trivial, right? But it made its way into the diaries. It meant something to people. Other groups in the organization really helped out by doing analyses and taking on any little tasks that they could. People on the team really rallied around. One person even postponed her vacation week so she could come in and work with her team. But no one showed more catalysts and nourishers than the team leader, who got in there, rolled up her sleeves, sat there all hours with the team, solving one technical problem after another, and nourishing their spirits, doing little things like singing a silly song at midnight on the 7th night. The result was a superb solution, delivered on time. It was a model of creative productivity. And how was inner work life during that week? Well, this is what one engineer had to say in his diary. The truth is, everyone is working crazy hours, doing impossible tasks, and still keeping on the cheery side of the street. God help me. I do love them so. I've seen it happen. If you leverage the progress principle, you can make a real difference for your organization, for the lives of the people working in it, and for your own life. So I'm looking forward to meeting you, chatting with you during our reception after the awards ceremony. And I want to take this moment to say to all of the award winners, I give you my warmest personal congratulations. Thank you very much.